Hello, I'm Fritz Mayer, Professor of Public Policy here at the Sanford School of Public Policy. And we're here with the Living History program of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. And I'm very pleased to be here today with my friend of longstanding, Tamera Luzzatto. Tamera, welcome.
Thank you.
Tamera is currently the Senior Vice President at the Pew Charitable Trusts, where she manages government relations for Pew. But prior to that has had a long career in public life, and particularly in the Senate, which we'll focus on a lot today, where she was a staffer for Senator Jay Rockefeller from West Virginia, initially I think a legislative assistant, and then legislative director, and eventually chief of staff. And then very interestingly, was recruited to become chief of staff for Senator Hillary Clinton, and served as her chief of staff for the entire time, I think, that Hillary was in the Senate, which was from 2001 to 2009. So lovely to be with you today and have a chance to talk about all of that. I thought we'd start maybe, though, just talking about how you got interested in politics. I mean, you've had a variety. I haven't even covered all of the things you've done, but you really, we knew each other a bit in college. You got interested early in politics, I think, and have really stayed interested in that your whole career. Where did that start?
I am happy to say I've devoted my entire, from teenage-dom to adult life, to a version of what I think of as public service and public policy and politics, since politics to me is the ends to the means of good policy. It started being a teenager in the 60s. That was when a whole lot of movements, one would say. There was a lot of woking back then. We refer to that, we didn't use the word woke, but there's a whole lot of woking going on right now. Yeah. And that was around the very divisive issues of the Vietnam War. I signed up to be against the war and to believe that Congress and President Nixon should withdraw the troops and end the war. A time of enormous amount of energy around civil rights and women's rights. And then I was a teenager when Earth Day was created around this new wave of consciousness back then around the dangers of pollution and all sorts of other risks to the environment. And that led to where we met, which is a place called, I guess you'd call it the Duke of the North, otherwise known as Harvard College in that town of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I had never thought of myself as being a politically, I would say, motivated person. But then in college, started to connect that my passions for certain policy outcomes, so withdrawing the troops from Vietnam, causing more racial justice, more environmental protections, that the way to bring about those policy changes could only occur through electing public officials, elected officials who were committed to those policy positions. I've never been a purist. There is no politician or political party that I think one could ever argue is perfect, but there are definite differences, and I saw as a person in my late teens and early 20s when I was at Harvard, that connection to wanting to get involved in democratic politics. So I was the first woman president of the Harvard Democratic Club when women back then were getting written about as the firsts. And that just sent me into that rabbit hole of always being involved in everything from policy to politics.
And describe briefly then your path after college. What was your first job, and then how did you end up with Senator Rockefeller in the beginnings of your career in the Senate?
I had the best start in Washington, especially being 22 years old, straight out of college. I ended up being hired by a rinky-dink small federal agency that doesn't belong any longer. And so there's nothing like being a little fish, let's say, but in a really little pond. And that agency ran then, doesn't exist any longer, VISTA, the Domestic Service Program, and Peace Corps, the still international national service program. And I got involved in some very successful projects back actually in contributing to promoting energy conservation when there was a major energy crisis in that Carter administration. And that led me to learn a whole lot about environmental issues, and that led to when the former Vice President Mondale ran for president. I worked on the Mondale presidential campaign when he was trying to become president in 1984, and that led me to want to work in the Senate. There was a big class of Democratic new senators then. The Democrats were still in the minority, but somebody named the 100th in seniority senator, John D. Rockefeller IV, that West Virginia elected to the Senate, decided to take a chance on me and hired me as what is called a legislative assistant, which really meant a policy advisor, largely on domestic social issues. So I did not want to remain involved in environmental issues. They never really rocked my boat. So, but I certainly knew enough about those issues.
Yeah, and talk about sort of the learning experience then of because starting as a young legislative assistant in a Senate office and then gradually assuming more responsibility over time, running a reasonably complicated operation, the Senate office. So what did you learn during that time?
I learned that in order to have any impact through passing legislation or stopping something, that one has to be willing to moderate and mediate and reach consensus and compromise. That compromise is not a four-letter word, as I'm afraid it often is thought of at the moment in this current Congress, in this current political environment that is just quite toxic and quite polarized and quite partisan. I also had the fortune and blessing of working for two, yes, progressive, you could call them, many have called them uber liberal, but certainly they would proudly call themselves progressive senators, Jay Rockefeller and Hillary Clinton, who were there to get something done and who had a work ethic that involved doing their homework, reading those briefing papers, discussing complicated issues, coming up with ways to strike a bargain with someone on the other side of the aisle, getting attention to their agenda, and doing the hard work of ultimately legislating.
And what were remind me the years that you were working with Rockefeller? And the reason I ask that is to get you to reflect a little bit on sort of the, in light of where we are today in our politics, the Senate of that time, and in particular the extent to which it was then possible to build coalitions across the aisle, to find compromises between the parties, to accomplish certain things. So what was the period?
My career spanned from 1985, Jay's first year, through early 2009, Hillary's last year before she became Secretary of State. And I would say the differences are quite profound in that when I started, most senators lived in Washington, which gave them social time to get to know and become friends with other senators. And by being together, often 5 days a week, I would like to note that I think at this point you're lucky if any member of Congress is in his or her office more than 3 days a week, because they're now on the road fundraising. They no longer live in Washington. When they did live in Washington, couples would go out to dinner, their kids would play on the same soccer fields, the families would see one another on Saturdays or Sundays at the baseball stadium or the soccer field or you name it. Once one has broken bread together or had that glass of wine together, or in certain cases of certain senators, bourbon together, they were more likely to develop friendships, and therefore that would lead to trusting one another and even liking one another. They might have been thoroughly at loggerheads over the policy positions, but they would tend in my earlier years with Jay Rockefeller. And I think because of Hillary Clinton's sort of work ethic, even in when I started with her in 2001, she certainly managed to inspire or motivate people on the other side of the aisle, her colleagues, and even in the other body, her Republican colleagues in the House, to work with her on areas that required some kind of compromise.
And did, just to follow up on that, did Senator Rockefeller live in Washington or spend time in Washington during the weeks? Or he's relatively close with West Virginia?
Well,
so
he had the advantage of being exceedingly wealthy, so that he
Yes.
easily could maintain a home in Washington, and did have a home in West Virginia. And West Virginia, being as close as it was not a big time proposition to go back as he would, every weekend. And certainly in our recess periods. And I went back. I traveled both states often to have also my own sense of state, and in some senses to represent each of those senators as their ambassadors.
And just to finish with the time with Rockefeller, I'm curious if there are maybe one or two high points from your time with Senator Rockefeller that you would point to as accomplishments that you're proud of that some way sort of illustrate the point you're making about the ability to work together.
Absolutely. Well, it's so wonderful to be able, with great relief, to say that one of those legacies is still alive and well and still doing the work that, sometimes we refer to policy efforts as causing unintended consequences. So my example caused the very intended consequences that are still serving poor children in this case. When Jay was a senator, we overlapped with Bill Clinton's 2 terms. And as some people remember, or some people know, the Clintons made an effort to enact a universal health coverage proposal. And that was a bust. That did not work out. We certainly worked closely with the Clinton White House to make that happen. And after that inability to cross that finish line to bring about universal health access and coverage, we got to thinking about what else could we do in the current circumstances, and discovered that there were 2 Republican senators and another Democratic senator, Ted Kennedy, Orrin Hatch, John Chafee, then of Rhode Island, a quite moderate to even liberal Republican, that were on the 2 committees respectively that had the jurisdiction. And they teamed up, and we enacted something called the Children's Health Insurance Program, which over the course of these now 30 years has caused poor families to have their children go to a doctor and get health care to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children. So CHIP is its acronym, and CHIP is chipping away at providing health care to kids.
Yeah. And really, that kind of thing is hard to imagine the same kind of bipartisanship today. I guess there's some issues, though, and we can come to this in a minute, but that you're working on around criminal justice reform, for example, where there are
yes,
some.
At Pew. There are not that many big issues. I mean, I did go through a period when it appeared that there were, in the Senate, sometimes when Ds and Rs decide to work together, they call themselves the gang of. Yeah. And there was a gang of D and R senators that wanted to enact an immigration reform proposal. And that certainly did not see much of the light of the day, and and lead to any kind of path to citizenship as they were attempting to sculpt.
Yeah, and that's something that might have happened in the past. The dynamics would have been different. It would have been easier probably for a gang to work somewhat less in the public limelight, less pressure on them, more
Yes.
likely to compromise, more likely to reach an agreement.
Yes, and I would say over all those years, and I can proudly say that Jay and Hillary resisted some of those some pushback against compromise, that I saw trends that seemed to cause a deterioration in almost the courage or even the willingness to come together and find middle ground. I like to joke that when we were in the minority party, we would get 30 to 40% of what we wanted, and when we were in the majority party, we absolutely had to have more than 50% of what we wanted, and that is not the tempo. That's not the I would say template. Let's say currently. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you about how you came to work for Senator Clinton. Well, first, how did you come to work for Senator Clinton?
I got one hell of a phone call from the White House when I found out that after she was elected, that while she had a notion of people that worked for her in the White House or people that worked for her on her Senate campaign, which I had not been part of, she had a notion of where she would place those people or where she thought she would place those people, so in what position, press secretary, scheduler, state director, et cetera. She had not identified anyone to run her office, to be what in the Senate is called the chief of staff, which is a little bit like running a small business. A personal Senate office can range from 30 people to even over 100 people, depending on what committees one's on and how much seniority you have and how big your state is, because there's a tie to the budget. So I, back in those days, and when I worked for that agency that ran Vista and Peace Corps, became friends with John Podesta. And John, at that point, when Hillary was elected, was Hillary's husband's chief of staff. So he was President Bill Clinton's chief of staff. And when Hillary evidently said in some session in preparing to become a senator or thinking about her next step, said, I don't have a clue who my chief of staff will be. And John said, well, I don't either. I'm paraphrasing from what I've been told, but I have a great idea for somebody that could help you get started. And her name is Tamera Luzzatto, and I was called in and saw her 5 days after she was elected. I thought we were going to have a version of an interview or conversation, and I'm introduced to her, and she says, thanks for doing this.
Was that right?
So, and then I went home. I went over back to the Metro to go home, and I said, so do you call a first lady back and say, I'd like to talk more about this? And I said, I guess not. I am now her transition director. And we totally hit it off. I started to piece together a picture for her of a typical structure of a Senate office and had to kind of catch up with some of the changes since I had left the Senate and show her how one manages a budget and what else is not on the budget, the mechanical things of setting up a Senate office. And I shuttled between the White House. I mean, I really did feel like, Eloise went to the plaza or something, and then shuttled between the White House, and I had this windowless, dark basement office that I would use for my Senate business and would then go see her at the White House or talk to her, because she was First Lady, of course, until she got elected, obviously, the first Tuesday of November of 2000. And she got sworn in the first Tuesday, as is the tradition of January, therefore 2001. But she was First Lady until January 20th.
So has anyone ever made exactly that move from First Lady to Senator? What were the challenges of that for her and then for you as you're trying to help her become an effective senator?
Well, for starters, I didn't know her that well and had not gone through her campaign. And I would say that what I hadn't expected is to find out how much demonization had occurred of her on the Republican side in the Congress. So I discovered when she became a senator, including to the point that certain Republican senators even told me that they, as one said, I think we all thought she would walk in with horns on. Mm-hmm. And that did inspire me to think about how to help her de-celebritize herself, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And that led to a slogan that had been written by some paper about her, that she is a workhorse and not a show horse. Mm-hmm. And that guided me in a big way. Another thing that I kind of came up with as a mode of thinking with Jay Rockefeller is I like to always say to the staff, what would we like our local newspaper, as well as, let's say, maybe a national newspaper, if they were to write about the end of that year? Mm-hmm. So I started Hillary's office off, and Hillary's office. So if we could read about how Hillary's first year in the Senate was in the New York Times, or the Syracuse Dispatch. I mean, the Times, they don't write things like that, but or let's say the Washington Post, a national paper and then a local paper, what we wanted to say.
What's the story you want?
And I always thought of what adjectives do we want to say. So I felt hardworking, sincere. I mean, the things that I learned through my Rockefeller years that people really care about. And then some nouns, so things like health policy and economic development and, some of our particular policy goals.
And I mean, the obvious question is, was she? I mean, it sounds like, from what I know of her, those adjectives are good. They fit her personality. But talk about that. I mean, about the extent to which she is, in fact, a worker.
For starters, it describes her entire life, and I'm just sorry that the rest of the American people that did not vote for her, both in the primary of 2008 and in the general of this last 16 race, didn't appreciate how important her attributes are to, I think, qualifying her to be a great president and a great leader. She has had tremendous attachment and passion for certain areas of public life and public policy. This also led her into politics because it is a means to an end to achieving good policy. Going back to college and throughout law school, she was one of the earliest staff members and did a lot of gutsy work for the Children's Defense Fund. And as soon as I spent time with her, I understood why she insisted on doing a so-called listening tour and go through these broad swaths of upstate New York that are largely Republican still to this day in terms of their voting habits, because she wanted to get to know the state that she had not grown up in and had recently moved to. And she outread us, out-knowledged us. I mean, I had to do a lot of figuring out how to keep up with her. I still remember her reading and memorizing every kind of, felt like Latin name about food additives, and that we better do something about the dangers of food additives and what kinds of listeria they create, et cetera, et cetera.
And so one of the fascinations, or I'm sure frustrations, in the campaign cycle was the difficulty she had in sort of projecting that image, or in coming across as kind of authentic in the depiction you have of her, and which sounds right, is that this is someone who has a genuine interest in these things, a real passion, and yet somehow that, whether for her fault or for other reasons, didn't quite come through. Why do you think that is?
Well, she at one point said, "I'm really good in prose and not so great in poetry," and then I think another reason, and it's connected to that, is that she is not comfortable making promises and declarations that she doesn't think is based on something that's doable and that and has some credibility to it. So she did have an awful lot of very lengthy policy proposals that kind of caused people to glaze over, and certainly did not appeal to the instancy that our now media environment wants. They want to be fed sound bites, and they want to have gotcha moments, and she just didn't feed that. She was not insightful and not I would say accusatory of all that many.
Hard to imagine a sharper contrast between her and her opponent in that campaign. Do you feel like we've come to a point, though, where a candidate or someone holding office really can't even say, "I don't know," or "I'm not sure," or "I would like more information," or show any sort of hint of indecision or weakness?
I think it's one of the tragedies that is the result of how hungry and insistent our media, and that includes social media, anyone on Twitter. I mean, Donald Trump has figured out Twitter, and that is that he gives people their drugs on a minute-to-minute basis of saying something as extreme or outrageous or controversial as possible. So yeah, it's very costly to not. I think about the Iran treaty deal that Barack Obama and Secretary John Kerry put so much effort into, and I'll never know who's right and what's wrong, and I never studied that issue, but the expectation to take a position on something that complicated that comes from our current media environment, and the fact that information can be conveyed, in nanoseconds, is a classic example. When I think of Jay Rockefeller days, you worked on NAFTA. We certainly did not make a decision about NAFTA overnight. We made a decision on NAFTA over the course of very thoughtful hearings and lots of briefings, and nobody then was expected to take a position on a trade deal in less than 5 minutes.
Painful topic, perhaps. Obviously, crushingly disappointing, probably for you personally, and in terms of your politics when then Secretary Clinton did not win the presidency. What kind of president would Hillary Clinton have been had she won?
For starters, I think she would have worked extremely well with Congress, and I'm quite sure, based on my interactions with members on both sides of the aisle, that she had impressed as Secretary of State, so not just as senator, because she was, of course, as Secretary of State, she would appear before the House and the Senate Foreign Relations Committees, and she had reasons to get support and to be in touch with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. So she would have had, I think, a quite sophisticated agenda that would have encouraged Ds and Rs to work together and would have had those kinds of relationships. I think she would have more easily explained proposals to solve and to deal with big problems and big issues. She certainly is very articulate that if you imagine, the Rose Garden speeches or demonstrating various meetings or forums or summits, she certainly had a way of bringing people to see a version of her point of view or her perspective.
Now,
and she would not have been golfing every weekend.
we know that for sure. Yes. But it had a little more robust schedule than the one we just came out.
She would have out-exhausted everyone at the White House.
Well, we won't know, but it does remind us that elections matter. As we record this, we're 1 week out from the midterm elections, and we do not know what will happen there. Let me in some ways move forward in your career to some of the work you're doing now, but really it's about a topic we've talked a little bit about, which is the change in the tenor of politics, the increasing polarization within the Senate, within the Congress, within the body politic. I know one of the things that you're working on is something that sort of comes out of your own personal experience, that is trying to, or bringing together, in fact, chiefs of staff in the Senate, and I believe the House as well, across the aisle, for the kind of conversations people used to have but stopped having.
Yes. So the synopsis is that when I was Hillary's chief of staff, I realized that as a chief of staff, with my background having been in working on policy, that when I was at the more junior levels of that Senate office, the earlier one, we as Democrats always intermingled with Republican senators' counterparts because of the committee structure and because if one wanted to work on broadband access, you knew which offices were also interested in that, and you just tracked them down. When one's a chief of staff, one is more like a CEO or the CFO, and not necessarily as involved in policy decisions or even discussions as I was with Jay and with Hillary. And there isn't any mechanism for those chiefs to get to know one another. We don't go over to like senators do, to the floor to vote. We don't bump into each other on the train over to the Capitol, that sort of thing. We don't necessarily know who one another is. So in my Senate years with Hillary, I helped spearhead what we now call the Bipartisan Senate Chiefs of Staff Initiative. And I like to think of it as being in the horticulture business. We're trying to plant the seeds of friendship, which in turn can cultivate bipartisanship, so that the more Democratic and Republican senators, chiefs of staff get to know one another, have maybe a beer or Chardonnay together and discuss, name your topic together, the more likely it is that they will pick up the phone and trickle across bipartisanship or trickle up bipartisanship to their bosses and encourage. I had an example with Clinton with then Senator Jeff Sessions, who was on the Armed Services Committee with her, and was able to, I would say, spur an agreement by the two of them on a particular piece of legislation that they put in front of and passed through the Senate Armed Services Committee, and trickled down so that we could assist our staff and sort of role model that kind of bipartisan behavior, and I would say temperament. And yes, so since I started at Pew Charitable Trusts, I have gotten some outside funding for helping the House chiefs do the same.
So one thing I think most people don't probably know very much about is how important staffs are. And I suppose we imagine that all the work is done by the senator or the representative, but in fact, staff is really important. So it matters that the staffs know each other across these offices a lot.
Very much so, because putting a piece of legislation together that could go into an actual law and affect real people's lives is not like drawing on the whiteboard. You have to have some research underneath it, and you need to understand the problem you're solving. You want to have intended consequences, like I said, for the Children's Health Insurance Program. So it takes a lot of, I would say, arduous work, and your boss has to know that you've done that work if you're a policy advisor or a decision maker. So, of course, we always credited our bosses for every good idea that he or she ever had. But there is a lot of time that goes into preparing those questions, to learn in an oversight hearing, to research a particular, I worked on just endless examples of that. And yes, so, but I will say that I am now reminded that one of the motivating arguments I made to those that were skeptical about bringing chiefs of staff together across the aisle is that as much as take the Jeff Sessions example, Hillary Clinton and Jeff Sessions as senators probably agreed on almost nothing, but they did find something on behalf of the military to work together on, and I would say the same thing about his chief of staff. I got to be very good friends with him, and one driving, I think, thought I had is that when each of us, whether we work for Jesse Helms or we work for Bernie Sanders, each of us that have one of those positions I've talked about, a legislative assistant, legislative director, chief of staff, we walk into that office building believing we're doing the same thing. We are a public servant. We are to serve our constituents. We're to serve our boss, and we are in government. The taxpayers are paying our salaries. So that we have in common. And there's only so much one can expect to bridge certain divides. But I experienced through those 22 years, there was always something that someone on the other side of the aisle would agree to work on.
And I'm curious, you've observed, been a part of politics in Washington for quite a while, and we've talked some about the state of politics right now, this extreme polarization. How optimistic are you that we will find our way back, or at least part of the way back, through the kinds of efforts you're making to bring staffs together, or other efforts to bridge divides, or other structural features? When you look at this, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Where do you see this going?
My middle name is hopeful. I wouldn't be in this business if I didn't believe that everything could make a difference. And there are many, many, many efforts. We've seen just take what the Parkland kids have done since that tragedy, and the fact that they chose to get right into the ring of policy and therefore politics, and go all over the country to pressure. I think I've read recently that since then 26 states have passed some form of gun restrictions, and you got to believe that there are plenty of other organizations, obviously Mayor Bloomberg's group and what came from the Newtown in Connecticut tragedy, the Sandy Hook, Gabby Giffords, but that really did light a bonfire of motivation and political pressure in places where probably some members that voted for those restrictions, maybe more rigorous, vigorous background checks, never thought they would be voting that way.
Well, it's encouraging to think of examples like that where it feels like we can still, that democracy still works, where we can make progress on these kinds of issues. Or on
where
issues
someone
that
would
face
have
us.
said,
Well,
I'll never do that, and then they saw they really didn't feel they had any choice.
one more area where perhaps a positive note, again, as we tape this, before the election, we don't know the outcome, but we do know that there are a record number of women who are running for office, who won their primaries, who are up in the general election in the U.S. House and the Senate and state houses around the country and governorships, et cetera. Let's assume for the moment that some proportion of those women have won. What difference does that make?
I believe, obviously, when I can be subjective, but I also hope that I'm objective, that in watching women in elected office, both in the House and the Senate, I have seen certain traits that mean if a significant number of women are elected next Tuesday to Congress, we will have probably a better shot at more compromising, more patient legislating, more devotion to true household bread and butter issues, because that's how they're getting elected. I read in one very contested contest in Virginia, there was a debate between the incumbent Republican and the challenger, a woman, and again, in these times, she never uttered Donald Trump's name. She would only talk about economic issues and the debate over which health proposal would respect pre-existing conditions, would guarantee health coverage to those that, oh my God, might have had cancer or be overweight or something like that. That, I mean, a woman almost by definition has a pre-existing condition. At any rate, so I think we'll see. I certainly saw from the women that I worked for, and were surrounded by that same interest in focusing on what matters to their constituents and largely in the form of economic and kind of household issues, I would say bread and butter issues.
For again, dangerous to make predictions, as you say, particularly about the future. As we think ahead to 2020 elections, there may well be a number of women candidates running for president. There are several possibilities.
Doing some of the familiar dance moves.
Will their candidacy have been helped by Hillary Clinton's?
Yes, in that I think in the form of, I think there's been some reflection and conscious, I would say almost consciousness raising, that there was an awful lot of misogyny and sexism that was thrown at her. This is where I'm going to be hopeful and not necessarily optimistic, but that will affect the way these women, and they probably themselves have learned about some ways to avoid some of the things that she was subject to. But also, I think a lot of women are going to get elected on Tuesday, and that's going to create some real momentum for the notion of a woman, once again having a shot to be in the Oval Office.
You've had a very distinguished career in public life. Today and again tomorrow, you'll be speaking with a number of students here at Duke. who are at the point of deciding what they want to do with their life. They are as idealistic as we were about wanting to make a difference in the world, but many of them, I think, despair of politics and public life as a vehicle to do that. Why should they be involved in public life?
Well, first of all, you do not have to be in the profession called politics, government, or policy to be doing your part. And one can volunteer, one can help another candidate, one can be active in your church, one can get active in a cause, gun rights, environmental, climate, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, we are talking at a time when a lot of grim events have happened around us, when it's a divisive, polarized, partisan time, and we just had, obviously, the massacre at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and many of President Trump's opponents' lives be threatened by a possible pipe bomb in the mail, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we all have something to do. We all have a role to play in toning it down and learning how to talk with one another. And I would say we need you more than ever. But idealism is something to think hard about, which is that idealism suggests that there is an ideal. My more favorite word is pragmatism, because if you're in the business, let's say the profession, and whether it's through a volunteer position or a paid position or a campaign or some form of government, you ought to be in it with a commitment to have an actual impact, and that takes that work of complicated, problem solving and solution creating and compromise and knowing that it's not overnight work.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, and thanks for your pragmatic career in public service.
It's a good North Star.
Thank you.